How long do you think that it's going to take your organization to bring the whole issue of reparations to the international community?
I personally think this is the sort of crusade that will take a long time if you are treating it globally. If it's a global crusade, I personally think you should treat it the way the early abolitionists treated the issue of abolishing slavery. Because at first everybody thought it was a non-starter, it would never happen. But the abolitionists didn't believe it would never happen. They just kept on at it. They got stronger and stronger, got more and more converts, became more and more credible, and then history gradually turned and supported their movements. So I think myself it's a crusade of a generation or more rather than a crusade of a few years. There are members of my committee who think it can be done more quickly. I just disagree. So the eminent persons are not, of course, of a single mind. We are all very independent people, but we meet and sometimes we agree to disagree. But I regard it as a long, drawn-out struggle to convince our people of African ancestry everywhere. Many of them are skeptical. We have to convince them that this is worth doing and it can be done. And we have to convince those on whom we are making these demands that this is a moral obligation. We have to convince them that we are not just playing up on their guilt, that this is an issue of paying back a debt, and that it is for the sake of themselves and their children, that the historical record and the moral account should be completed.
Mm-hmm. If you were to try to put a time period on how long it's going to take for this issue to be brought to the international forefront, are you talking 20 years, 50 years, another 100 years, or how would you assess that?
Well, there's a bit of a romance in some of my dates, yeah, because I tend to think of the years 1884 to 85 as very symbolic years for the colonization of Africa and breaking up, because a meeting took place in Berlin, which resulted in the partition of Africa. So I tend to think of the year 2084-85 when everything is completed. Yeah, so 100 years, 200 years from the original sin, as it were. You have everything completed, and the West at last emerges from the history of the damage it had inflicted on people of Africa and of African ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
But of course that's just an imaginative year. It's a year tied into history. It's a year tied into a particular tragedy in the history of black people, when Europeans sat in a city in Europe and said, okay, let's carve up this continent among ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are those who suggest that people of African descent are not deserving of reparations, since purportedly some Africans aided in the capture and enslavement of other Africans. Mm. How do you respond to that, and how extensive was the role of Africans in the enslavement of other Africans?
I think any people who participate in the enslavement or exploitation of their people are usually themselves victims, but they are victims of a different category. If you look at South Africa, I was in South Africa a few weeks ago. There are a lot of people there who are black, but who worked with the white folks as part of the machinery of repression. The black folks who worked as part of the machinery of repression were themselves victims of that repression, although they were used as instruments for that process. In the days of slavery, there are a lot of slaves who were used to guard other slaves, to prevent other slaves, to punish other slaves if they disobeyed, to whip other slaves. You can always use the oppressed against each other. And that's what happened in Africa. There are many who are used for an evil trade. The demand was created by the West, and when you create a demand, sooner or later you begin to create suppliers. you create accomplices in that evil trade. So I regard those accomplices as part of the area of victims, but there are different categories of victims. Some victims are themselves partially reprehensible, and some victims are complete victims who should be treated differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, how extensive was the role? I mean, to what degree did Africans participate in the capture and enslavement of other Africans?
Oh, there was quite a bit, yeah. There's no doubt, quite a bit. You go and negotiate with people and say, look, if you don't do this, they will come and raid your village, you see, because I'm going to negotiate with them, you see, to raid your village. So sometimes you're faced with a kind of threat. It's them or you. And they're, okay, I'll cooperate to enslave them. So that's why I say they're all in the domain of victimization, but there are different levels of victimization.
Mm-hmm. Assuming that there is a willingness on the part of the West to redress the destruction of the great enslavement, how would you or your organization propose to dispense the dispensation of monies or whatever form the reparations would come in?
Well, again, let me speak for myself, because our particular group has not reached final decisions about some of these issues. For myself, I see reparations as taking three different forms. One would be what you suggest, kind of capital transfer. You provide money and then you have to decide who is to be entrusted with the utilization of this money, you see. And there are many people in Africa who say, you don't entrust them to African governments. They don't deserve to be trusted, but many of them have mishandled African resources. If not African governments, then who else? We have to get into that issue. Should it be done by some other institutions that are specially created for the purpose of the utilization of these enormous amounts of money? And how are you going to choose those? This is capital transfer. The second major area of reparations is skill transfer, because the damage is not historically, the damage to black people is here and now. Black people worldwide are damaged, marginalized, incapacitated for all sorts of roles, and it's all due to the long history of victimization and exploitation. It's not something in the past. The damage is here and now. And part of that damage is the destruction of the capacity to help ourselves. So there isn't enough skill capacity in the African and black population of the world. So skill transfer, deliberate utilization of resources to promote and enhance the skill capability of the black world as a whole, what I call global Africa. The third area is power transfer. In addition to capital transfer, skill transfer, power transfer. This could take the form of just more effective representation in institutions which already exist and which exercise a good deal of power over Africa or over black people. For example, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. At the moment, power there is distributed on the basis of who puts in the money, who is rich. You can so structure it that you increase the voting power of Africa deliberately, not because Africa is rich, but to compensate it for its previous impoverishment. Or you could give Africa a veto in the Security Council of the United Nations, not because Africa is already powerful outside, but because A, Africa has been weakened by history, and B, many security problems of the future from now on, which the United Nations will be involved in, will occur in Africa. And Africa should be there to exercise leverage and monitoring. So reparations, to me, doesn't have to limit itself to the first category of capital transfer. And these are some of the ideas I'm going to try to discuss more fully with my colleagues in this group of eminent persons, you see, and then try to promote with the Organization of African Unity.
What European nations, Dr. Mazrui, should be most responsible for the bulk of the payment of the reparations, and where does the United States come in?
What nation should be responsible?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a tough one, really. Two ways of assessing those things. One is to say, well, countries which were most active in the slave trade, for example, you see, or countries which benefited the most from the slave trade. You see. So the United States is a major beneficiary of the slave trade, but was not a major participant in the shipping of slaves or capturing the slaves. They just benefited. They were sold to them. They were major recipients. Whereas Great Britain and even small countries like Denmark were at one time or another major slave dealers, you see, that participated in the slave trade. So you may have different criteria of determining who is liable, who ought to be persuaded to pay. And then some countries no longer have African populations internally. Others have huge African populations internally. The United States and Brazil have huge African populations internally. Now, should Brazil be regarded as a country that ought to be receiving reparations, or should Brazil be part of the paying of reparation? Is the Brazilian establishment part of the paying or part of the receiving? So this Brazil would be a borderline case to be discussed very carefully. And then some of the worst offenders in colonization are very poor, like Portugal. You see, you won't get very much money out of Portugal, although they held parts of Africa for centuries. Their empire was the oldest European empire within Africa. So all these are issues we have to examine, and we are aware of them, and we will investigate them, and we will try to sell them to the international community to see what would be a rational, fair, and equitable way. The purpose is not to put people in the dock. It's really to try and persuade them that there is a moral debt which cries out for payment, and to convince them that it's about time this debt was indeed paid.
Dr. Mazrui, there are those who suggest that African Americans in particular have received a form of redress for the enslavement of their forefathers through affirmative action and EEO legislation. How do you respond to those folks who would suggest that?
Peanuts, really. I mean, the thing is, with individual African Americans today make it. But in general, what have been happening in the United States is that the entire African American community has moved from being a kind of colony comparable to a British colony, which it was at the first half of the 20th century, but internalized, to a colony comparable to a French colony. And let me explain. In a British type of colony, which is where I grew up in Kenya, blacks were segregated. There were separate schools, there were separate lavatories, there were separate doors, this, that, and the other, and there were separate types of incomes for the same job. So in the first half of the 20th century, African Americans were treated like that, although they were not a Kenya. They were internalized within the United States. They were basically an internal colony of black people. What has happened in the second half of the 20th century is a shift. It's a shift that has converted African Americans into the equivalent of a French colony. In the French colony, individual rose very high, very high. So it was possible in a French colony for someone like Houphouët-Boigny, who later became president of Côte d'Ivoire, of the Ivory Coast. During the colonial era, it was possible for him to rise to be a member of parliament in France, to be a member of the cabinet of the French government. It was possible for the president of Senegal to rise high in the politics of France, not in the politics of Senegal, the politics of France, to rise very high. It was possible for the president of Senegal, a colony, to help in drafting the Constitution of France, which Leopold Senghor did. The present Constitution of France, of the Fifth Republic, among those who helped to draft it was Leopold Senghor, an African from a former French colony. So what had happened in French colonial culture is the collectivity remained subordinate, but individuals within it could rise very high. Yeah. So in the United States, that is what has happened in the second half of the 20th century. For African Americans, now it's a French-style internalized colonialism. So the collectivity of African Americans is still subordinate, yeah, with high proportions of infant mortality, unemployment, areas of non-legal but real segregation, etc. But individuals can rise very high. Yeah, we can even sometimes say we can claim the presidency, although it's not going to happen this century. But we can attempt to get more and more of our people into Congress. But it is the Congress which is the equivalent of the Parliament in Paris for colonials from Africa. So when you say, okay, there are some African Americans who have made it, yeah, these are African Americans who have made it in conditions which are still basically those of internalized colonialism, because the collectivity of the African American population is still discriminated against, disadvantaged, with disgracefully high rate of infant mortality, unforgivable rates of unemployment, difficult rates of undereducation, etc., in a country which is basically the richest in the world. It's quite unforgivable. So to cite those examples of those of us who have made it as therefore nullifying the case for reparations is to overlook the real foundations of this society.
Mm-hmm. There are a number of African nations with significant mineral wealth that are still in serious debt to their former colonializers through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Should debt relief be a part of the reparations package?
Yeah, some members of my group, members of my group of 12, do think along those lines, that one way of doing it is to get them to extend debt relief, you see. And if we did it, I would say it should be only part of it. The chances are these debts are never going to be paid. These countries will never pay them anyhow. So it's giving the West too easy an option to say debt relief, because most of these countries can never pay them, can never pay these debts. The West will continue to squeeze them, but they'll never get that money out. They use them as an instrument of torture rather than as a method of getting their money back, you see. So I personally regard debt relief as only a small part of the reparations issue. But there are, I must tell you frankly, members of my group who are more attracted by the debt relief and debt forgiveness argument than I am.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mazrui, what precedents have been established that support the validity of reparations for African people?
Well, as you know, the Jews suffered a lot in the 20th century under the Nazi Holocaust. I've just come back from Berlin, and curiously enough, by the side of the Berlin Wall, which these days every visitor has to go and see, you have trenches connected with the SS Gestapo, the Nazi tyranny, which preceded communism in that part of Germany. So they suffered a lot. What happened after the war? Well, ultimately the Jews got a lot of money from West Germany. The State of Israel also got a lot of money, although it didn't exist at the time the Holocaust took place. So there's pushing it backwards. It received a lot of money in compensation afterwards from the Germans. And then they've been busy discussing right now whether the so-called comfort women, whom the Japanese exploited as forced prostitutes for Japanese soldiers during World War II, they are demanding reparations. Most of the world said they should get it. Japan is beginning to feel the pressure. Now they are thinking of ways of doing it without admitting it. They say, we'll set up this foundation, we'll set up that foundation for them. And these women, it was repeated rape. There's no other word for it. When you get women to do that time and time again, and you say they're comfort women, that's just a euphemism for repeated systematic rape. And they're demanding that. Now, most African women who are exported to the United States who are subjected to repeated systematic rape, that was what enslavement for women meant, repeated systematic rape. It was without their consent, etc. The Korean nation generally is demanding reparations from Japan for colonization, you see. And Iraq has been subjected to international sanctions, partly in relation to paying compensation for a few months of occupation of Kuwait. A few months of occupation of Kuwait. Not several hundred years of enslavement. A few months of international community says that's absolutely right that they should pay compensation. The world is used to issues of reparations and compensation, except for the enslavement and colonization of black people. Suddenly, it ceases to be tragedy and becomes comedy. As soon as you cease talking about compensating Japanese women or Japanese Americans who are interned by Roosevelt, you see, or compensating Kuwait, suddenly it becomes a joke if you apply the same principle to compensating black folks. And we have to shock ourselves out of that mentality, and we have to shock the Western world out of that way of thinking, and treat this to be as serious a matter as those other ones.
I've talked with a number of people just within my own particular circle, people in the community, people in the academic community, and what have you, about the whole issue of reparations. And it seems to be a cynicism that is in existence with all of the problems that African Americans in particular are experiencing right now with drugs, crime, young people killing one another in urban centers and in rural areas as well. And people say, well, those are the problems that we need to be facing as a people, as a collective, and not some pie in the sky form of redress, i.e. reparations. How do you respond to that type of mentality?
First, I agree the problems you mentioned are problems. I don't regard that as unrelated to the damage which was done to black people by the history of enslavement and exploitation. I regard it as part and parcel. When I say the damage is here, I include the high proportions of criminality, the degree to which drugs are so omnipresent these days in black neighborhoods, the children having children, all the difficulties that are exaggerated within the African American community. To say that this is unrelated to the damage done to African American people is ahistorical. You know, it's insensitive to the causes of history, you see. So nor would our group say we shouldn't address other problems. We have to address other problems as we go along. This crusade, as far as I'm concerned, is going to take a long time. It's one issue out of many that we have to address. And some, it is true, are immediate, they have to be done today, some they have to be done this year, some they have to be done this decade. You see. But that's no reason for saying forget this one, because it's long drawn out Otherwise, abolitionists would have given up ages ago, before slavery was ever abolished, because it looked hopeless at the beginning.
Dr. Mazrui, I've seen figures that fluctuate anywhere from 50 to 60 to 100 million Africans who lost their lives during the European transatlantic slave trade. Some African experts even see the figure as it being even higher than that. What does your research indicate?
Well, first, I wouldn't limit it to those lost their lives at sea, because the business of capturing slaves involved a good deal of warfare. You attack villages, you turn people against people. So there are a lot of casualties before the actual capture as part of the process of capturing, you see. So most figures just limit themselves to who died after people had actually been enslaved, and forget that the process of enslavement itself was destructive and did a lot of killing on the way towards catching others. It is true, it's very difficult, nevertheless, to compute what the total figure is. So I'm as defeated as many historians, but I would say those who are on many figures, on big numbers, I think are at least morally justified, because the numbers are wider than those who perished just in the Middle Passage. There were many who perished pre-Middle Passage, who perished in the raids for slaves, sometimes who perished in the forts by the sea, waiting to be exported, because they were packed in there, and sometimes every so often there would be epidemics breaking out that would kill them. There was no attempt at sanitation or health. You know what happened with refugees running away into Zaire from Rwanda. It doesn't take very long to start epidemics. You can imagine what it was like in unsanitary conditions 300-400 years ago, you see. So many perished before they touched water, and therefore the numbers were horrendous, but I'm reluctant to put a figure to them.
Now, we've talked a lot about the European responsibility insofar as reparations go, but there certainly was an Arab influence there in the slave trade as well. You want to expound on that?
Yes, the Arab slave trade was older but smaller. Yeah, so it was older, it had started much earlier, so it was 1,000 years older than the transatlantic slave trade. It was smaller and on much smaller ships, of course. I lived in a part of East Africa where I lived with the ships. The dhows came in. Those dhows had been coming in for hundreds of years. Yeah, they would take a dozen slaves at a time. So you're really talking about a much smaller scale of slave system. And then I personally don't think we should make claims on the Arabs at the same time as making claims on the West, because the system is so different. First, their system of lineage sometimes makes it difficult to determine which person is former slave and which person is former master, because they have genealogical co-optation upwards, you see. So many African Americans here have blood from their masters. If this was an Arab country, they would all be Arabs. They would move upward to the status of the master, but in this society they didn't. They remained downward to the status of the slave, you see. So today you go to Saudi Arabia and you see many Saudi princes who obviously have African blood, you see. But if you tell them they're African, they say, "What do you mean? I'm an Arab," you see, etc. They're very proud, even feel insulted you call him an African, you see. And that's because of this genealogical co-optation upwards. So to mix the two systems would blur any distinctions and would make no sense whatsoever, you see. And so I have recommended at meetings that if we want to deal with the Arabs, it should be done separately and at a different time. Otherwise, we are going to start quarreling among African countries themselves And secondly, you're going to mix two systems of slavery that are vastly different from each other, you see. We haven't even had an Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat was half African, and he was president of Egypt. There's no equivalent in the United States or Brazil or whatnot of someone like that who rising up to the top, you see, who was former slave. So it's a different system you're dealing with.